If I told you there's a plant you can put in the ground once and keep harvesting from for decades, sometimes for the rest of your life, you'd probably assume it as either exaggerated and practical or one of those things that only works in a very specific climate with perfect conditions. That's fair. I used to think the same way. But after years of growing food, testing miracle crops, watching trends come and go, and quietly comparing what actually produces versus what just looks good on YouTube thumbnails, one plant kept proving itself over and over again. No drama. No hype. Just results. The plant is Jerusalem artichoke, also known as sunchoke, and once you understand how it works, the real question becomes why more people aren't growing it. Most people hear artichoke and picture something fussy, slow, and high maintenance. That's not what this is. Jerusalem artichoke isn't even related to globe artichokes. It's a perennial sunflower relative that grows underground tubers similar to potatoes, but behaves completely differently in the garden. You plant it once, and if you don't actively try to remove it, it comes back year after year stronger, taller, and more productive. I've seen patches planted decades ago still feeding families today with almost no intervention, no annual replanting, no seed starting, no babying. What makes this plant special isn't just that it survives, it's that it produces serious calories with very little input. We're talking about a crop that tolerates poor soil, handles drought better than most vegetables, laughs at frost, and doesn't care if you forget about it for weeks. In the real world, where people are busy, budgets matter, and ideal conditions rarely exist, that combination is rare. I've grown trendy greens that needed perfect timing and constant attention. And I've grown high-yield annuals that exhausted the soil after one season. Jerusalem artichoke doesn't play that game. It quietly builds a food reserve underground and waits. The first time I grew it, I didn't expect much. I planted a few tubers along a fence line where nothing else really thrived. By late summer, the plants were towering 10 feet tall in some spots, with bright yellow sunflower-like blooms. But the real surprise came in fall. When I started digging, the ground was packed with knobby tubers, far more than what I planted. And here is the thing nobody tells you early on: you don't even have to harvest them all. You can leave most of them in the soil and dig only what you need. They store better underground than they ever will in your pantry. That's one of the biggest mental shifts people struggle with. We're conditioned to think food has to be harvested, cleaned, stored, and protected. Jerusalem artichoke flips that logic. The ground becomes the storage system. As long as the soil doesn't freeze solid, you can harvest fresh tubers well into winter. Even after frost kills the stalks, the food is still there, waiting. From a resilience standpoint, that's huge. Now, is it perfect? No. Anyone who tells you that hasn't actually grown it. The tubers have a unique carbohydrate profile, high in inulin instead of starch, which is great for gut health for some people, but can cause digestive discomfort. If you eat too much too fast, that's not a flaw, it's a learning curve. You cook it properly, you introduce it slowly, and your body adapts. Experienced growers know this and plan accordingly. Beginners usually learn the hard way, then assume the plant is the problem instead of the approach. Another thing people misunderstand is control. Jerusalem artichoke spreads. That's not a rumor, it's reality. But spreading doesn't mean uncontrollable chaos. It means you plant it where you actually want a long-term food patch, not in your main vegetable beds. Think edges, borders, back fences, or dedicated zones. Once you understand that, it stops being a problem plant and starts being exactly what it is, a perennial food system. This is where years in the trenches really matter. I've watched people chase high-maintenance crops because they looked impressive online, only to burn out after 2 seasons. I've also watched quiet growers stick with boring, reliable plants and slowly build abundance without stress. Jerusalem artichoke falls firmly into the second category. It doesn't win beauty contests. It doesn't get pushed by seed catalogs the way flashy hybrids do. But it shows up every year, no matter what. From a cost perspective, it's almost unbeatable. Once established, you're not buying seeds every spring. You're not replacing plants that failed. You're not constantly amending soil just to keep it alive. A small patch can produce hundreds of pounds of food over time. And because it's not mainstream, the tubers are often cheap or even free if you know where to look. I've linked reliable sources in the description for those who want to start clean and avoid random stock. But you don't need anything fancy. If you've ever planted something because everyone said it was essential, and then quietly stopped growing it because it wasn't worth the effort, you're not alone. I've done that more times than I can count. That's why I pay attention to plants that survive neglect. Not because neglect is the goal, but because real life happens. And food systems that only work when everything goes right aren't systems at all. Quick question for you. Have you ever grown something that surprised you by how little work it needed? Or on the flip side, something that everyone hyped up that completely disappointed you? Drop it in the comments. That kind of real-world feedback is how we separate theory from reality. In the next episode, I will break down exactly how Jerusalem artichoke stacks up against common staples like potatoes and sweet potatoes, not from a nutrition label, fantasy standpoint, but from actual yield, effort, and long-term reliability. I'll also show you the specific mistakes that cause most people to give up on it too early and how to avoid them without overthinking the process. One final thing before you go. If you're serious about growing food that works with your life instead of against it, start paying attention to what quietly survives, not what trends loudly. Jerusalem artichoke isn't ignored because it fails, it's ignored because it doesn't need selling. If this kind of real, experience-backed breakdown is useful, hit like, subscribe, and check out the next episode when it drops. Once you understand how plants like this really fit into a long-term system, it changes how you see everything else you grow. If you want to understand why Jerusalem artichoke stays off most people's radar, you have to compare it to the crops everyone already accepts as normal. Potatoes. Sweet potatoes. Corn. These are staples for a reason, but not always for the reasons people think. When you strip away tradition and marketing and look at effort versus return, season after season, the picture gets more complicated. Let's start with potatoes, because that's the comparison everyone makes. Potatoes are productive, familiar, and versatile. I grow them, I respect them, but potatoes are also annuals. That means soil prep every year, seed stock every year, pest management every year, and a very specific harvest window. Miss that window and you're dealing with rot, pests, or storage losses. With Jerusalem artichoke, you plant once and shift into maintenance mode. No yearly replanting, no seed potatoes to buy. The plant handles its own life cycle, and you step in only to harvest. Sweet potatoes bring their own strengths, nutrient density, flavor, and decent storage, but they're even more demanding. They need warm soil, a long growing season, and careful curing. In much of the US, that's already a limiting factor. One bad early frost or cool summer can wipe out yield. Jerusalem artichoke doesn't care. It thrives in places sweet potatoes struggle, including cooler climates and marginal soils. That flexibility alone puts it in a different category. Now let's talk about yield, not in ideal test plots, but in real backyards. Under average conditions, Jerusalem artichoke produces more edible biomass per square foot over time than most annual root crops because you're not resetting the system every year. Even if a single season underperforms, the plant rebounds. That long-term yield stability matters more than one good harvest. People don't usually think in those terms, which is part of why perennial food crops stay misunderstood. There's also the labor factor, which almost nobody measures honestly. When people say a crop is high yield, they rarely mention how much work went into it. Tilling, weeding, hilling, harvesting all at once. Storage management. Jerusalem artichoke spreads that labor out naturally. You harvest when you want. You leave what you don't need. You don't rush against the calendar. That's a different kind of efficiency, one that favors consistency over peak performance. This is where annual staples dominate culturally, even when perennials make more sense practically. Annual crops fit industrial systems better. They're predictable, uniform, and easy to standardize. Perennials like Jerusalem artichoke don't play well with that model. They're messy. They're localized. They don't scale cleanly for centralized distribution. None of that makes them inferior, it just makes them less visible. Another reason this plant gets overlooked is flavor expectations. People expect it to behave like a potato, and it doesn't. Jerusalem artichoke has a nutty, slightly sweet taste when cooked properly, and a crisp texture when used raw in small amounts. But it's not a direct substitute. That difference turns some people off early. Experienced growers adapt their cooking instead of forcing comparisons. Roasting, slow cooking, fermenting, these methods transform it into something people actually enjoy. When prepared correctly, it earns its place. It's also worth addressing the digestion issue honestly, because ignoring it helps nobody. The inulin content is real. For some people, it's a benefit. For others, it's uncomfortable at first. That doesn't mean the plant is bad. It means dosage and preparation matter. Cooking reduces the impact. Eating small amounts builds tolerance. Long-term growers know this and adjust. The mistake is treating it like a bulk starch right away. That's not how it works. One advantage that rarely gets mentioned is how forgiving Jerusalem artichoke is during bad years. Drought year? It still produces, neglected plot, it survives, missed harvest. It stores self underground. Compare that to a failed potato crop, where you lose both the food and the seed stock for next year. That resilience is invisible until you need it, and by then it matters a lot. If you've ever planted a perfect crop and then watched it fail because life got in the way, you already understand why this plant deserves attention. It's not about replacing everything else you grow. It is about anchoring your food system with something that doesn't collapse when conditions aren't ideal. Quick check-in: have you ever grown a crop that looked great on paper but didn't survive real life? Or one that quietly kept producing while everything else struggled? Those experiences are worth more than any gardening chart. Share them if you've got them. In the next episode, I'll walk through the exact reasons people give up on Jerusalem artichoke in the first year, and how most of those failures are actually setup problems, not plant problems. We'll talk placement, containment, harvest timing, and why expectations matter more than technique. One thing to keep in mind as we go: food security isn't about chasing the best crop on paper. It's about choosing plants that forgive mistakes. Jerusalem artichoke does that better than most, which is why those who grow it long-term rarely stop. Once you understand how to avoid the early missteps, this plant becomes one of the easiest decisions you'll ever make in the garden. Most people who say Jerusalem artichoke didn't work for them didn't actually fail at growing it. They failed at placing it. That distinction matters. This plant doesn't need skill to survive, it needs boundaries. And almost every bad experience I've seen with it traces back to ignoring that reality. The first mistake is treating it like a normal garden vegetable. It's not. If you drop Jerusalem artichoke into your main raised beds or mixed vegetable rows, you're setting yourself up for frustration. The tubers spread underground, and if you harvest casually, small pieces remain. Those pieces will grow. That's not aggressive behavior, it's how perennial roots work. The solution is simple. Give it a dedicated zone: edges, fence lines, corners, places where permanence is a feature, not a problem. Experienced growers don't fight the plant. They plan around it. When you plant Jerusalem artichoke where you want a long-term food source, its persistence becomes an asset. When you plant it where you expect annual turnover, it feels invasive. Same plant, different expectations. The second common failure is harvesting too early or too completely. New growers get excited, dig everything up in the first year, and then wonder why it doesn't come back strong. Jerusalem artichoke builds its real momentum in year 2 and 3. The first year is establishment. The smart move is to harvest lightly at first, leave the smaller tubers in the ground and let the patch mature. Long-term abundance beats short-term curiosity every time. Another issue is misunderstanding timing. Unlike potatoes, which signal harvest clearly, Jerusalem artichoke improves after frost. Cold triggers the conversion of inulin into sugars, improving flavor and digestibility. Harvesting too early not only reduces taste, it reinforces the idea that the crop isn't worth growing. The plant didn't fail. The calendar did. Containment scares people, but it doesn't have to. You don't need barriers, trenches, or complex systems. Consistent harvesting at the edges keeps the patch in check. Some growers use mowing or cutting stalks to manage height. Others simply accept the size they planned for. The key is deciding upfront how much space you're willing to dedicate and then sticking to it. Unplanned permanence is the enemy. Planned permanence is power. There's also a psychological mistake that's harder to spot. People expect instant validation. They want the plant to prove itself in one season. Jerusalem artichoke isn't flashy. It doesn't deliver a dramatic reveal on camera the way some crops do. It rewards patience, not excitement. That turns off people who are chasing quick wins instead of systems. Then there's the taste issue again, because it keeps coming up. The people who hate Jerusalem artichoke almost always prepared it wrong or ate too much at once. Roasting changes everything. Slow cooking changes everything. Fermentation changes everything. Long-term growers figure this out and stop talking about it, which leaves beginners stuck repeating the same learning curve alone. One thing I've noticed over the years is that people who stick with this plant tend to think in years, not seasons. They're not trying to maximize one harvest. They're building something that quietly works in the background. When you frame it that way, the decisions become obvious. You stop asking, "Is this perfect?" and start asking, "Will this still be feeding me in 5 years?" Jerusalem artichoke answers yes to that question more often than most crops. If you're listening to this and thinking, I tried something similar and gave up too early, you're not alone. Almost everyone who now grows perennials confidently had to unlearn annual thinking first. That transition is uncomfortable, but it's also where the biggest gains live. In the next episode, I'll show you how Jerusalem artichoke fits into a real-world food system alongside other crops, not as a replacement, but as a backbone. We'll talk stacking, complementary plants, and how experienced growers design gardens that don't collapse when attention drops. One last thought to leave you with. The best food plants don't demand loyalty. They earn it over time. Jerusalem artichoke earns it quietly, season after season, by doing exactly what it promises, showing up when you need it. Once you stop judging Jerusalem artichoke as a standalone crop and start seeing it as part of a system, its real value becomes obvious. Experienced growers don't ask, what does this plant replace? They ask, what does this plant support? That mindset is the difference between gardens that constantly demand attention and gardens that quietly hold together when life gets busy. In a practical setup, Jerusalem artichoke often lives on the outer edges of the growing space. Not because it's less important, but because edges are where perennials shine. Tall stalks act as wind buffers. Dense growth shades soil. Deep roots mine nutrients that shallow-rooted annuals can't reach. Over time, those nutrients cycle back into the system when stalks are cut and returned as mulch. The plant feeds more than just the person harvesting tubers. This is where it pairs naturally with shorter, more delicate crops. Greens that bolt in heat benefit from partial shade. Annual vegetables benefit from reduced wind stress. Even pollinators benefit from the late-season flowers, especially when many other blooms are gone. None of this requires extra effort. It's a side effect of letting a perennial do what it already wants to do. Another overlooked role Jerusalem artichoke plays is psychological. When you know there is food in the ground that doesn't care if you miss a week or a month, you make better decisions elsewhere. You're less likely to panic plant, less likely to overwork soil, less likely to chase every new trend. That kind of confidence compounds. Gardens run better when the grower isn't stressed. In mixed systems, this plant often anchors rotation-heavy beds. Annual crops can fail without collapsing the whole plan because something reliable is always there. That's not theoretical. I've seen it play out during droughts, travel-heavy seasons, and years when attention was limited. The perennials carried the system while the annuals caught up later. People sometimes worry that dedicating space to Jerusalem artichoke is wasteful. That concern usually comes from underestimating long-term yield. A small patch can outproduce several annual beds over time, not in a single dramatic moment, but steadily. When you factor in saved labor, reduced inputs, and lower replanting costs, the math shifts quickly. There's also an educational gap. Most gardening advice focuses on optimization, maximizing yield, efficiency, or aesthetics in isolation. Jerusalem artichoke operates in a different category. It's about resilience. It's about fallback systems. It's about designing for years when things don't go according to plan. Those years are more common than people like to admit. If you've ever had a season where everything went right, you know how good that feels. But if you've had a season where everything went wrong and still harvested food, you know which one actually matters. That's where plants like this prove their worth. Quick pause here. If you had to choose one crop in your garden to survive neglect, weather swings, and missed schedules, what would it be? Most people realize they don't actually have one. That's the gap Jerusalem artichoke fills. In the next episode, I'll get specific about harvest strategy, how much to take, when to leave it alone, and how long-term growers avoid burnout by harvesting in a way that matches real life instead of ideal schedules. This is where most people accidentally turn an easy plant into a chore. One final takeaway for this episode: strong systems don't rely on constant attention. They rely on smart placement and forgiving components. Jerusalem artichoke earns its place not by being impressive, but by being dependable, and that's what keeps it in serious gardens long after the trends fade. The biggest shift that happens when people stick with Jerusalem artichoke IS&T in the garden, it's in how they think about harvesting. Most of us are trained to harvest everything at once. Clear the bed, store it, move on. That mindset makes sense for annual crops, but it actively works against perennials. And when people feel overwhelmed by harvesting, they blame the plant instead of the habit. Long-term growers treat Jerusalem artichoke like a savings account, not a paycheck. You don't empty it unless you have to. You take what you need when you need it, and you leave the rest to continue compounding underground. That approach removes pressure. There's no right day to harvest. There's no race against spoilage. The food waits. The most reliable strategy is staggered harvesting. Early fall, you might pull a few tubers for testing and meals. After frost, you harvest more heavily as flavor improves. Through winter, if the ground allows, you dig selectively. In early spring, before new shoots emerge, there's one last window to harvest before energy goes back into growth. Miss a window? The plant doesn't punish you. It just keeps going. This flexibility is what makes Jerusalem artichoke compatible with real life. You don't have to reorganize your schedule around it. You fit it into the margins of your time. That alone is why people who adopt this plant tend to keep it permanently. Another burnout trap is overprocessing. New growers feel like every harvest has to be cleaned, stored, and preserved immediately. That's optional here. Because the ground is the storage, you can skip steps. No curing, no bins. No constant checking for spoilage. When you're ready to use it, you harvest fresh. That simplicity compounds over years. Now let us address the quiet question a lot of people have by this point. If Jerusalem artichoke is this reliable, why isn't everyone growing it? The answer isn't sinister, it's structural. It doesn't fit neatly into modern food systems. It doesn't ship well. It doesn't store like potatoes in warehouses. It doesn't benefit from uniformity. It thrives in decentralized, personal spaces, gardens, homesteads, edges. That makes it powerful for individuals and irrelevant to large-scale promotion. That's why it survives through people, not institutions. Someone plants it, it stays. They share tubers. It spreads quietly. No campaign needed, no hype cycle required. Just time. If you're listening to this and realizing that your garden has been built mostly around attention-demanding crops, that's not a failure, it's just the default model most of us inherit. Adding Jerusalem artichoke isn't about abandoning what you know. It's about giving yourself a fallback that doesn't ask much in return. Here's the final expert insight I'll leave you with. The most valuable plants aren't the ones that perform best in perfect conditions. They're the ones that still perform when conditions aren't perfect and when you're not either. Jerusalem artichoke earns its place by being there when you need it, not when it's convenient to show off. If this series helped you see food plants differently, take a second to like and subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives like this. And if you want to start your own patch, I've linked trusted sources and basic setup notes in the description to save you time. Remember, real abundance isn't loud, it's steady. And once you build it, it tends to stick around longer than you expect.